and I'll open it for everyone to come in.
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
I hope you're getting settled. This is going to be a wonderful hour and such. So get settled in because we've got so much to share with you. And as you join us, please put in the chat where you're calling in from, where you're joining us from. Previously, we've had hundreds of participants from all corners of the country. And it's just so exciting for us to see who we're connecting with, who's interested in this topic, and what's happening in your community. So let me begin in a good way and say, ha mitakiapi, shante waste, napachiuzapi. Hello, my relatives, and I greet you with a warm heart and handshake. And I'm so pleased to be here with all of you again today. And for those joining us for the third series, welcome back. And for those of you joining us for the first time on this really exciting topic of data, I think it's very exciting. Again, a special welcome to you. This is our third session of our four-part webinar series. And this one is called The Power of Data in Native Early Childhood Development. I'd like to again thank the Office of Early Childhood Development at the Administration for Children and Families and our Deputy Assistant Secretary, Katie Ham, for partnering with ANA to program this webinar series on Native Early Childhood Development. Over the past two sessions, we've emphasized that early childhood development is a critical component of self-determination, tribal self-determination, and individual self-determination. And I'd like to think that through ANA grant funding and funding available throughout ACF and our engagements, like what we're doing today and in person and community, we're demonstrating to you our sincere and genuine commitment to promoting the optimal growth, development, and well-being of Native children and families. So data, why data? Well, data plays a crucial role in shaping impactful Native early childhood programs. And by collecting and analyzing this data, we can better understand the unique needs and strengths of our communities and allow us to tailor programs that more effectively and culturally appropriately serve our Native children and families. And it's really through this data collection and analysis of Native ECD programs that we know quality early education. And we know what that means and we know what its impacts are. And that means that we also know from this evidence that these programs and services tend to lead to long-term social and economic benefits. Children who take part in early childhood education programs are 25% more likely to graduate from high school, 4 times more likely to complete a bachelor's degree, and less likely to face academic problems, including things like repeating grades and dropping out. We also know that children who learn their native languages during this period of critical development, brain development, also show strong attributes of resiliency and problem solving, and also develop durable senses of self-identity, which is so critical for carrying their native cultures into the future. One of the key benefits of data is that it helps identify these gaps in services, quality of services, and also gaps in services. So by examining enrollment figures, retention rates, outcomes, especially with respect to the needs of our Native nations, we can pinpoint areas that require additional resources or targeted interventions. So the key point, the point here is key, since this underscores the ability of data to empower advocacy as well. We need more funding, we need more resources, we need some more teachers and curriculum supports, we need facilities, right? And we need advocates on our behalf to do this kind of work. And when we have strong evidence and culturally relevant data that demonstrate the impact of early childhood education on long-term outcomes, we can ensure that the data reflect the realities of our communities in your own voices and effectively communicate the importance of investing in our programs to those stakeholders and policymakers and potential funders. A lot of our work is both public and private funded. So philanthropy is a very important partner in the work that we're doing. In today's session, we will explore the importance of data for Native early childhood programs, and we'll touch on topics such as data sovereignty, collection, privacy, best practices to utilize this data for impactful outcomes. And we really hope that you'll enjoy today's session. So Pila Mayaye, thank you. And I really appreciate all of you being here today. And I'm going to pass it on now to Katie Ham, our Deputy Assistant Secretary for Early Childhood Development.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Katie Ham, and I'm the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Early Childhood Development at ACF. And thank you, Commissioner Knusch and the Administration on Native Americans for your partnership in supporting data sovereignty in tribal communities. At the Office of Early Childhood Development, we work closely with more than 520 tribes and tribal organizations all across the programs we administer. And that includes the Child Care and Development Fund, Head Start, and Tribal Home Visiting. We know that data plays a crucial role in shaping effective programs that deliver impactful outcomes for children and in shaping effective policies that meet the true needs of tribal communities. We also acknowledge the traumatic history of data collection and use by the government and respect the rights of Indigenous peoples and nations to control how their data is collected, stored, and used. Data plays a critical role in shaping early childhood programs and can be used to provide targeted support and services to children and families. Our goal at ACF is to work alongside tribes in support of Indigenous data sovereignty as we focus on data collection that tells this tribal story of the impact of federally funded early childhood programs in tribal communities, as well as shaping solutions in areas where there might be need for reform. We support data collection and use that aligns with the interests and benefits of tribal communities. Indigenous data sovereignty can help to ensure that early childhood programs in tribal communities reflect tribal culture, traditions, and priorities. Indigenous data sovereignty empowers tribes to develop early childhood programs that support self-determination and honors the culture of each tribe. And we're excited to share examples of this work during today's webinar. Thank you all for being here. And with that, I'll hand it back to Commissioner Knusch. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. So glad to see you here again with us. Next, we're going to welcome Dr. Deana Aroundhim. Dr. Aroundhim is a research scholar leading the Child Trends, an awesome organization, in the development of their applied research agenda to advance the well-being of Indigenous children, youth, and family. Her work specifically aims to improve the well-being of American Indian and Alaska Native children and families through culturally and scientifically rigorous research and evaluation. Dr. Abrahamson's lived experiences as a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, as a mother and a relative, inform a career that respects tribal sovereignty, builds on cultural strengths, and seeks to inform the policies and programs encountered by Indigenous families. Welcome, Deana.
Deana, it's so nice to be here with you all today and have the opportunity to set the stage and provide some foundations for how we can think about leveraging the power of data in Native early childhood development. As was mentioned, my name is Deana Abrahamson, and I'm a citizen of Cherokee Nation. I live and work from Cherokee Nation, and I am glad to have the opportunity to meet with you all today. I want to acknowledge that my presentation was developed in collaboration with my colleague, Lachey Jake. So I'll be covering the content, and she was a collaborator in developing the information. So we can go ahead and move on to the next slide. So the goals for the next roughly 12 minutes will be to define some foundational terms and concepts so that we are all working from the same type of information, draw some connections to how these concepts apply in Native context, And then finally, I'll share an example from the Tribal Early Childhood Research Center, which I am a team member of, and we have a very collaborative approach in our work, and I can show how some of that is feeding into changing the data story for Native early childhood, and I'm glad to have some of my colleagues on the call today as well as panelists. You can go to the next slide. To get started, I think it's important to really just define what we're talking about. We say data, but that can mean a lot of things when we sit in different spaces and maybe have varying degrees of connection to the data that's collected about Native people or from them. The terms that are important to have a grounding in are shown here as sort of this or that, although there are lots of nuances, and this is just a simplified version of some things that you may hear in your day-to-day work with data in the communities that you serve. So we talk about primary data collection being the data that we define what's being collected, and we are actively involved in collecting that data ourselves. There also may be opportunities where we are looking at data that's been collected by someone else or for another purpose, and we are analyzing it to understand different things. And so we have to be very cautious in that regard to understand what the data was originally collected for and how it may or may not fit exactly with the questions that we're asking of the data for a different purpose. The second point on here is about the importance of understanding that there's both quantitative data, which is sort of numbers, counts. We're really familiar with seeing those things in particular from a programmatic perspective. But then this also highlights that data can be qualitative in nature. There's a lot of power when we combine both quantitative and qualitative measures and data sources. So qualitative data can really help us tell a story in a different way. And this becomes really critical when we're talking about working with Native populations, when our population size or the service population that we're working with is small, and it can be difficult to do some more rigorous or complex analyses of the data. So stories can be really important, and they're particularly important in highlighting the next point here, process. So we talk about data in terms of process and outcomes data. Process data really tells us how things are working and being implemented, whereas outcome data is typically focused on whether or not we achieve the goals that we set out to achieve. And outcome data can be more at play when we're doing things like complex regression analyses to understand the relationship between a set of variables with one another. You can move to the next slide. A term that we've heard a couple of times already in the first few minutes of this session is Indigenous data sovereignty. So I want to acknowledge that this is something that has primarily been growing and taking root in other Indigenous contexts in Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and the United States, is more recent to this dialogue and ongoing work, but we're already covering a lot of ground, and there's some amazing work happening in Arizona and other places where data sovereignty and trainings and opportunities to learn about applying this concept in our communities is beginning to take root here and well underway in some communities. So on this slide, you just see that Indigenous data sovereignty is sort of broken down to some key components that this derives from recognizing the inherent sovereignty of Indigenous peoples, that there's rooting in community held information, that there's a governance and rights structure that's applied, and that ultimately the knowledge that's gained from collecting data with Indigenous people should live and remain a part of the decision-making and processes of those very communities that contributed it. Go to the next slide. I want to highlight an example of where you can learn more about a place where some of these structures are a little bit further along in their application. So the First Nations Information Governance Center in Canada has been leading some of the efforts in regard to health data and Indigenous data sovereignty in that space. So some of the early work in the First Nations communities in Canada really defined the OCAP principles, ownership, control, access, and possession, as being critical to realizing Indigenous data sovereignty. And then they've layered on elements of a governance structure that can help Indigenous peoples be at the table and guiding and owning that data that is being collected with their communities. Some other principles that you may be hearing about in these types of conversations are the FAIR and CARE principles, and I can provide some links to those in the chat. But there's a lot on this slide, and I encourage you to look up First Nations Information Governance Center and the report linked if you would like to learn more about what's happening in Canada and how we can use that as a vision for what we might see in the US. Go to the next slide. So I also want to comment that this is important to think about in terms of how we design and conduct research and evaluation. And underlying that is really an important element of having Indigenous people at the table. So this participatory research and evaluation approaches are really important for making sure that the policies that govern data and data use are informed by tribal values and tribal research practices. We've heard more and more recent conversations around Indigenous research methodologies and Indigenous research methods, and how those can be applied in research and evaluation projects to really reshape the conversation about the stories being told about Indigenous people. When participatory approaches are used, this can really be an important part of the process of minimizing harms that can occur in the research process and really maximizing the benefit in data collection with Native families and communities. And I think it's really important to keep that in mind, that we always want to minimize harms, but it's really critical to also balance that conversation with maximizing benefit. There's so much opportunity in better defining the data that we're collecting and then using it in ways that serve our people and our communities to make decisions on behalf of Native families. So there's some more links here on the slide that you can take a look at later, and I'm going to move along to the next slide. So here, I just want to kind of put some of the information I shared in a visual picture for you, that some of the key components of research, evaluation, or the life cycle of a program, which is shown at the top with the dark colored arrow, are similar, regardless of the population that you're talking about. So there's an idea for a program or service or an evaluation or research project. You have some partners at the table, you maybe do some proposal writing, you implement the project or the service, and then you perhaps share and disseminate your results. You also see at the bottom of that, the data life cycle of implementing the program, the service, the research project is where that data is generated. So you have a process where you're creating the data, you're processing and documenting and analyzing that data, preserving it in some way, deciding where you're going to store the data. You're perhaps granting access to that data by engaging in a data sharing protocol. And then you may perhaps reuse that data for other purposes. So that's the idea of that secondary data analysis coming into play. On the back of all of this, behind those circles, is the Native children, families, and communities. And I think that when we add that context for these processes, it requires some additional thinking of us as partners in this work, right? We want to have those Indigenous worldviews and perspectives of health and well-being, which is shown by the figure to the right of the slide. that those have to inform each part of that cycle and process. So we want to make sure that our worldviews and perspectives are shaping what ideas are even on the table, the partners who are at the table and helping make decisions, how we write the proposal, how we define the research questions, how we define the methodologies and the approaches that we're going to use, the methods for collecting the data. And then each part of the data lifecycle has to be informed by that worldview and perspective in order for us to actually achieve the concept of Indigenous data sovereignty. So we need to be involved and active in these conversations. And it's really exciting that there's wonderful things happening in Native communities that are driving us in that direction. And I think there's still a lot of work to do in terms of the practices that we apply. So there've been some great templates and resources shared, and I'll include some of that in the resources slides at the end of this deck. Move on to the next slide. I just provide this quote here to get you thinking about the discussion and the panel that you'll engage in later today. Is how can your data become a determinant of well-being for Native children and families? So the quote here says, the possibility exists that while care may not be going to those who need it, it is certainly going to those who articulately demand it. So when we're part of the process and we're defining the research questions and methods that result in the data that we collect, we are actively engaged in that process in a way that tells people what is valuable to our communities. So I've said the phrase a couple of times in recent conversations, measure what you value and others will value what you measure. So if we are defining those questions that result in the data, then we're going to move our communities in a different direction that aligns more with our beliefs, what we feel is important for the well-being of our children. So I want to show you an example next of what this can look like in practice and with the Tribal Early Childhood Research Center. Our mission is really to grow the field of early childhood research in partnership with a variety of programs and services that engage Native families. So for example, Head Start, home visiting, childcare, TANF program providers, and other national leaders and experts. We shape our work around 3 key areas: national leadership, so speaking about what we're learning actively as we do it, conducting scientifically and culturally rigorous research and evaluation, and then strategic dissemination of those efforts. We engage an approach that is very partnership driven, and we use an approach called communities of learning, where we invite all of our partners to be a part of the process as a project takes shape and as we engage in data collection and interpret that and disseminate the results of the projects that we conduct. Next slide, please. So a lot of our work is informed by this measurement development cycle shown here. We think a lot about the various measures and assessments that oftentimes programs and services serving Native children and families are required to use. So we ask ourselves, does the measure assess what we think it's measuring and what's actually happening in Native communities? Is there a requirement that that measure has to be used? Or are there ways that we can supplement that measure or perhaps adapt or change it or start from scratch to better meet the needs of the families engaged in the program or service? So you can see some of the areas where we focus our research and evaluation work within the TRC around program needs, effective practices and systems, around measurement, and around language and culture in early childhood programs. I want to show you a couple on the next slide. A couple of our communities of learning currently are focused on understanding early relational well-being, family economic well-being, Native culture and language, and workforce needs assessment. This is where we're actively working around what is the data that's needed, what's the data that's currently available to tell us about these things, and how can we reshape those data collection efforts to tell the story that needs to be told to benefit Native children and families. The next slide goes into a little bit more detail about our early relational well-being community of learning. And this just gives you a quick snapshot of, there's my timer to stop, a snapshot of the things that we're thinking about in terms of data collection. At the start of my presentation, I highlighted that there's both primary and secondary data collection. There's process and outcomes data collection. And this effort with early relational well-being really started from a place of hearing a need to understand how parent-child interaction works in early childhood settings. and whether or not some of the measures that are currently being used in those settings need to be culturally adapted. As we came together as a community of learning starting in 2021 and talking with program partners, we reshaped those questions to ask actually what is happening in terms of the interactions of a Native child and what will support that Native child being well. We've come to a place where we are looking at early relational well-being and the practices that exist in Indigenous communities to support a relational identity for Native children. And we have used data, like existing data through AIA and FACES, to begin to understand and define a measure. And we are preparing to launch a pilot data collection effort with a new measure that we've created to understand this construct of early relational well-being as something that's better defined and aligned with the perspectives and knowledge of Indigenous communities. So that just gives you a quick snapshot of how data can exist in many forms and can be used to tell a different story about Native early childhood. The next slide, please. So I wanted to close out with just a couple of examples of resources that I find helpful in terms of thinking about data for Native early childhood. I've included some links to the Native Nations Institute in Arizona, the Collaborative Research Center for American Indian Health Data Management Toolkit, which breaks down concepts of primary and secondary data sources a little bit further, and the ways that you might need to think about storing and managing those types of data, as well as some other sources of data, including the Administration for Children and Families recently released data strategy as something to go back and take a look at. Next slide. So to close out, I just want to say, Wodo, thank you so much. And I've included some contact information for the Tribal Early Childhood Research Center so that if you have questions about our work and want to learn more, you can find some information there. And there's also contact information if you'd like to get on a listserv that we distribute information to pretty regularly through the final email address listed there on the slide. Thank you so much for your time, Wodo, and I look forward to the conversation with the panel and the breakout.
Oh my goodness, thank you so much, Dr. Around-Him. That is such a profound presentation, and I hope we're able to really dig into some of those concepts. I love this phrase that you use, the story that needs to be told. I'm just so taken with that. Here's maybe a silly question. Some people say data, some people say data. Is there a preference in the profession, and what should we be saying?
Oh, that goes right around with what we call ourselves as Native people. You can call yourself by your tribe, whatever is comfortable to you. Yeah, there are data. As long as we're focused on it and making it better, I don't think there's a right or wrong.
Great. All right. Let's welcome our panel of early childhood and data experts. I use data interchangeably, so forgive me if it sounds a little confusing. So now we are joined by Ann Cameron, the Head Start Director of the Intertribal Council of Michigan. We have Dr. Jessica Barnes-Najor, the Director of Community Partnerships at Michigan State University. Tess Abrahamson Richards, who's the Director of Data Sovereignty at Hummingbird Indigenous Family Services, and Dr. Erica Roberts, who's the Deputy Director of the Tribal Evaluation Institute at James Bell Associates. Welcome, everyone. We're just so pleased to have you join us. I'd like to give you each the opportunity to introduce yourselves and share a little bit about the work you're doing in collecting and using data in the context of tribal Indigenous data sovereignty. So let's start with Ann, and then we'll go to Dr. Barnes-Najor. Then we'll go to Tess Abrahamson Richards, and then Dr. Roberts. Over to you, Ann.
Hi, everybody. I'm Ann Cameron, and as was stated, I am the Head Start Director with the Intertribal Council of Michigan. I have been working in this Head Start program for the past 37 years. And during this time, we've been engaged in a research partnership with Michigan State University for, gosh, going on about 20 years, I think now. So yeah, that's me, and our research partnership is called Wiba Anang, which means early star in the Ojibwe language. And in our research partnership, as I'm speaking today, I'll be coming from the community partner perspective.
Thank you. Dr. Barnes-Najor.
Hi, everybody. I'm actually out in the field today, so I'm in a little bit of a different background. But it's great to be with you all. I work at Michigan State University. I'm also honored to be a part of the Tribal Early Childhood Research Center, along with Deana and other colleagues here, which is amazing. And Anne and I have been working together, as she said, for a really long time. We've been working together since about 2006, I think. So that's quite a long time, going on 20 years. And as a developmental psychologist, it's been really wonderful to be able to partner with Intertribal Council of Michigan, and through our Wiba Anang project, all of the tribes in Michigan that have Head Start and Early Head Start, and also home visitation programs, to be able to identify the kinds of data that are important and meaningful for the programs and for the tribes, and then to work collaboratively to gather those data so that we can, again, inform the work that's being done. So, and then also through the Tribal Early Childhood Research Center, as Deana said, we also work with many other tribes across the country. And Anne and I have been co-investigators for a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation research project, where we were able to work really intensively with 5 different Head Start research, Head Start centers, to work with those centers to identify what data were most important to them to gather about their Head Start programs and about their classrooms. And those data that we, and then we provided support for the centers to gather the data themselves, so that those data were their data, not our research project data, but they were each program and each tribe owned the data themselves, and we facilitated and supported them in gathering those data, and also then provided supports on how to use the data in a meaningful way. So those are just some of the things that we've been doing.
Very impressive. Wow, and you kind of become family after that many years, right?
We're definitely family now.
Good. Tess, over to you.
Tess Clixt. I'm Tess Abrahamson Richards. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a citizen of the Spokane tribe, and I'm the Director of Data Sovereignty at Hummingbird Indigenous Family Services, which is a birth to 3 focused nonprofit based in Seattle, Washington, here on Coast Salish territory. We have an Indigenous birth keepers doula program, the Pilimakua Family Connections and Early Childhood Home Visiting program, and a perinatal guaranteed income program. We also have our data sovereignty department and a storytelling department that work closely together. And as Director of Data Sovereignty, I think the job title really says it all. Our department was launched about 1.5 years ago with the explicit goal to embed data capacity and research leadership within community and under the same mission as our direct service programs. I think at Hummingbird, we felt like we hear the call for more community level data capacity all the time, but we still saw a lot of division between the organizations who were doing that data work and the organizations doing the actual service work on the ground in our community and in Indigenous early childhood spaces more broadly. We also have a lot of passion for Indigenous methodologies in research and evaluation, and passion around data advocacy. So we focus on developing that methodological training across Indigenous, Western, and other ways of knowing for our staff and for our team as we support data and research for the programs that I mentioned and try to think innovatively about what our research designs can look like. It's nice to be here. Thank you.
Wow, I love that you have a department of storytelling. What does that say about the value and importance of narratives? Wow, fantastic. All right, over to you, Dr. Roberts.
Thank you. I have to say the composition of this panel is really nice. I feel like we all touch on data and capacity in kind of at different levels. So hi, I'm Erica Roberts. I'm a member of the Lumbee Tribe of North Carolina, and I work at James Bell Associates, and I've worked with James Bell for 9 years and always on the Tribal Evaluation Institute. And I was the project director, and that contract has ended, and now we have the Tribal Home Visiting Resource Institute for Excellence, and I serve as the project director for that as well. And in both of those capacities, our role has always been to support tribal home visiting grantees in anything related to data. So it kind of spans the data collection, data reporting, data management, data systems of all the data they collect for their grant, data visualization, communicating the data back out, local evaluation, and continuous quality improvement. And we sit at this really nice space where we're tasked with supporting the grantees, but we also support our ACF partners in building their capacity to create data requirements and data guidance that is informed by the context of the tribal communities. So we have a nice opportunity to kind of build capacity in both spaces. So thank you for having me.
Yes, I agree. This is a wonderful composition of panelists. And so let's get right to the first question. And Tess, I think you sort of said the title Data Sovereignty speaks for itself, but I'd actually like to hear from each of you what that means, tribal or Indigenous data sovereignty. What does that mean to each of you? And then describe a little bit about how your work is actually supporting data sovereignty. So Tess, I'm going to start with you.
Yeah, you're right. It doesn't necessarily, as a term, speak for itself. I think I meant like we were running to make that a forefront that goal when we created this department. But yeah, we're in an urban Indigenous community. We serve Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, First Nations, American Indian, and Alaskan Native relatives here in our community. And so we're not based in like a federally recognized tribal setting. And partly because of that, and partly because of our values, we're thinking beyond just like a governance framework for sovereignty when we're thinking about data sovereignty and thinking about how we include all of our communities collectively in this fight to have really what we're thinking about with data sovereignty, which is self-determination, authority to oversee our data and our data narratives, and to build collective power, like within our community across organizations, but also nationally being a part of advancing this conversation around including Indigenous people in data, around like Indigenous communities having authority over our data and data stories, and around supporting capacity building for people that don't know much about these topics to understand what Indigenous data even are, and therefore, if they're working with those data, what their responsibilities are for ensuring that Indigenous governance over data is taking place.
Fantastic. I'm going to move next to you, Jessica. Give us your perspective on Indigenous data sovereignty, please.
No, I think it was really important what Tess mentioned about the recognizing first and foremost self-determination, tribal self-determination. And I think data sovereignty comes from there. I mean, you know, tribes as sovereign nations are supposed to have the capacity to have that self-determination. And so from our work, we always focus on identifying what are the goals of the tribe, what is the information that will help the tribe to lead to those goals or reaching those goals, help them understand how to get there. And from there, we can start talking about data sovereignty. I know there, of course, there are elements of data sovereignty of where the data are stored, who has access to the data, who's able to analyze the data and use the results of those data. But I think it starts even before then. It starts with that self-determination of saying, what are the data we're going to gather? And why are we gathering these data?
Right, right. I really take that to heart, especially as we look at ANA's own evaluation process and question the very need to collect certain kinds of data and what are we using them for, and how does that express the goal that we're trying to work toward, which is describing the impact and effectiveness of our programs. So thank you so much. I'd like to ask another question and just be aware, Erica, I'll turn to you first, kind of go back to my law professor days. But can you describe a little bit more about how you think data can be used to support early childhood program quality in Native communities? I know that quality is sort of subjective, and we have qualitative as well as quantitative data. So how do you think that we can use and employ data to show and demonstrate quality, or the lack of quality, perhaps?
I think it dovetails with the sovereignty and also the challenges related to collecting data in the space. I think that answer should go to the programs on what quality programs are and how data could be useful to examine their programs and share information about quality, determine what it means to be a high quality program. And I think that goes back to the data sovereignty discussion, that data sovereignty at like its most basic level is just ownership and management and who has rights to use data and approving it. But getting deeper into that, and I'm glad Tess brought up in the urban environment too, because going beyond that government to government relationship, but really any community, it's having folks involved in the beginning discussion on why data are even going to be collected and what are we trying to measure, and who is informing the indicators and the questions and defining those terms and allowing the time and space for all of that to happen, to determine how to capture quality programs.
Thanks. I'll turn it over to you, Anne. You're actually directing a program that probably has a lot of data elements that you're required to collect and report on. And then if you'd like to speak to that, but also you work for, you're part of an intertribal partnership. So how do you distinguish one tribe's priorities and data sovereignty needs relative to the others?
Well, from the very beginning, when we started our project, we put together a rather large planning committee with representatives from each of our Head Start sites. We had community members, we had Head Start employees, Head Start parents, community members like from tribal colleges and things like that. And this was a year-long process, and we really worked together to talk about what kind of data we wanted to get from our project and why. And then eventually, what are we going to do with the data? And it was, I think that process is really what set us up for this long-term partnership, honestly. So yeah, and then you know, some of the things that we've been able to do with the data, like we've been able to write other grants using data from our projects. We've made program improvements, and then, you know, the projects that we work on in our research partnership actually tie right into our goals from our Head Start program that we build into our 5-year grant application. So it just kind of merges and it just all works together at this point.
That's beautiful. All right, I think I'll just do a real quick round robin with all 4 of you. What do you see as the biggest challenge in building capacity to collect and use data in Native communities? And we'll start with you, Jessica, please.
Sure, I think maybe this is just because it's an issue that we've dealt with so much in our own work, but I think one of the biggest challenges is around the fact that we are really lacking research instruments and tools that accurately reflect the cultural contexts that we work in. And that's a huge challenge. We can set up great processes and have wonderful partnerships, and we can have community partners who are really adept at gathering good, gathering data. But if our tools aren't very good, because our tools don't accurately reflect the cultural context, then that's always going to be a limitation.
May I ask, by tools, do you mean like survey instruments?
All kinds of tools. So our survey instruments, for example, there are survey instruments that help us to identify social emotional development of young children. If those survey tools are asking questions that aren't appropriate for the cultural context or even the physical context, right? That's going to be a challenge, like children walking upstairs. That's an example from an older tool. When in some communities, there may not be stairs. That's just a quick example. Or our observational tools. If we're using observational tools that don't really accurately gather information about the very unique contexts that our communities are in or have. For example, I see the question about needing some real life examples. If we have, for using, for example, the classroom assessment scoring system is a tool that we, many in early childhood use in the classroom context. And there have been changes from that measure, from the very first instrument to the second edition, to make it more culturally sensitive. And that's great. But there are still things about the cultural context that are really important, like really culturally grounded ways of learning. So in some of our work, we found that it's very important in many communities for children to have opportunities to learn through observation. They learn through observing. In Ojibwe, there's a word Gikinawabi, which means to learn through observing. And that's a very common concept and an important way for children to learn that's culturally grounded. And many of those forms of learning that are more culturally rooted are just not present as fully, right? Because it's so focused, right? In other communities, we may not see that. So we're not going to see it in these very general tools. And so what we have been advocating for is, we may need to use some of those tools and can learn wonderful things from some of those other tools, but maybe we also need some culturally specific tools, some tools that tell us about those important aspects of culture that support young children's development in positive and healthy ways that we're not getting from those other tools. And I see Gina put in chat, other examples from chat, ASQ and ASQSE are definitely other.
Yeah, I see this as another conversation opportunity. But Tess, let's turn it over to you. And what would be a challenge that you see in building capacity to collect and use data?
Yeah, thank you. I think on the data collection side, there's a couple things I think about. I think exciting things are happening to overcome barriers as well. I think that training Indigenous researchers, for example, has exploded thanks to those people who have put in work to build that pipeline in our communities, and that's so needed for our data capacity to have people who are positioned to lead that work and trained to lead that work. And I also think that there's been exciting things happening on the funding side, because there are systemic barriers to where funding goes or has historically gone. Like usually it's universities or specific research agencies who are able to get funded to actually lead data work. But there's been some exciting things that have come about more recently that challenge that standard model of who can do research and what a research agency is. And then on the data use side, it's just kind of the same thing we always say, like whether it's surveillance data or large national surveys and so forth, like Indigenous people need to be included in those data sets, and our leadership needs to be centered in that process of including and using our data.
Yeah, agreed. Thanks so much. Erica, over to you.
Sure. I agree with what's been shared. I think there remains to be often a hesitancy towards data collection in community, and there's a lot of great work being done to help overcome that as well, but that can be a challenge for using data. And I also think, what was shared before just around if folks aren't involved, or the community is not involved in creating the instruments or the purpose of the data collection or the research questions, then trying to find meaning and utility out of that data that you didn't really inform can be a little challenging if it's not organized in the right way, or it doesn't collect things that are of interest to the community. And we try to work a lot with the tribal and visiting grantees on ways to make the data that's collected for ACF reporting and for program improvement, really thinking about how can you connect that back to your program? How can you get home visitors excited to collect data with families and to see, because there's also sometimes for home visitors like a hesitancy to want to collect data from family members and feeling like it's an additional thing that they have to do. And so we try to help home visitors understand how this data can be really helpful for them to serve families in a really good way and to know the families more, and also to help improve their programs and to understand needs in the community and be able to make shifts in their model and their curriculum and their service delivery. So yeah, we continue to kind of try and address this gap.
Fantastic. And we'll give the last word to you, Anne.
Well, I think in terms of building capacity as the community partner, gosh, I received a lot of like on the ground training. What does all this mean? Because the idea of doing research is kind of intimidating, I think, for some program people who aren't familiar with research and why it's important. And I've been a member of the TRC steering committee, and so having the knowledge, that decision makers are using data to make decisions about us and for us, in terms of policies and laws and things like that. And so we felt very empowered and felt a real importance to participate in gathering some data and contributing to the pool of research in the early childhood arena for private communities.
That's fantastic. We often hear from our tribal advisory committee, nothing about us without us, right? We need to be part of the conversation and input into what decisions are made and why. So thank you. Thank you each of you for this wonderful, really fascinating conversation. And Now, I think we're going to open it up to everyone else to have a chat with you. We're going to move into our breakout rooms, and each of our panelists today will lead a breakout room. This has been an opportunity that's been very meaningful in our past 2 sessions because you get to ask those pithy, really pressing questions. So, and Cameron will be in room 1. Dr. Barnes-Najor will be in room 2. Tess, you'll be in room 3. Dr. Roberts in room 4. And feel free, folks here on the call, to ask them about anything that's burning. We've got a lot of questions in the chat as well. And then we'll rejoin in about 15 minutes or so to wrap up. So we'll see you in a bit. Enjoy the breakout rooms. Hello, everyone. We're back together again, and unmute myself. All right, now can you hear me? We're back together again. We had a fantastic discussion in our breakout room, and I hope you did as well. I just really love the emphasis on strength-based evaluations. You know, not coming in with judgment or preconceptions, and not judging a community or a program, really trying to look to see where they're coming from. We talked a little bit about traditional learning, that many of our children learn by watching and observing, and the patterns that we see from our elders, especially our grandparents. This is also fantastic. And another good takeaway that I have is using community advisory committees. And that's something I will take very close to heart, and we take a look at ANA's evaluation processes as well. So thank you to our panelists and to our participants for another incredible webinar, and we could do so much more on data, perhaps sometime in the future. I want to appreciate your time, your attention, your interest in this really important topic. It's near and dear to all of our heart, but we know that our children are our future. So all of our investment, we're pouring it into our future. Next and last session in this webinar series is November 7th, again at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. This next session, we're going to be exploring flexible funding strategies. I mentioned a bit earlier about private-public partnerships, and so many of our native ECD projects are funded with multiple streams. What can we do to really improve funding and resources for native ECD? So we look forward to seeing you all again soon. And give us some feedback. We love feedback. We love your data in terms of what we're doing, how we're doing, and what's of value to you. So thank you so much, everyone. Take good care. Bye now.